Hi all, welcome to a comparison of sorts. In this lab, we'll be exploring and comparing the time complexity of different sorting algorithms. We'll start out by exploring a simple sorting algorithm we've already seen called selection sort, which we will implement in Python. We'll then discuss time complexity, which is an important aspect of algorithm design. Later on in the course, we'll learn about more formal analyses of time complexity, but in this lab, we'll actually use the Python time library to experimentally time how long it takes for our scripts to run over a range of array lengths. We'll then implement and time a very clever divide and conquer sorting algorithm called Quicksort and compare its time complexity to that of selection sort. In this lab, we'll encounter an interesting phenomenon in that different algorithms can be optimal in different contexts, and we'll design a hybrid sorting algorithm that chooses between selection sort and quicksort depending on the context of the problem. We'll finish off by briefly exploring the algorithms that Python uses for its sorted function and sort method on lists, and comparing the efficiency of Python's built-in sorting functionality to that of our implementations. It should be an interesting lab. Let's get started. Okay, we'll start off with selection sort, which is a simple and direct algorithm for sorting data in an array. The basic idea behind the algorithm is to partition an array into a section that is sorted, which is initially empty, and a section that is unsorted, which initially spans the whole array. Then, as long as the unsorted partition still contains data, we find the smallest value in the unsorted partition, swap it with the value at the boundary between the partitions, and advance the boundary. As we do so, the sorted partition grows and the unsorted partition diminishes until the sorted partition spans the entire array, at which point the data is sorted. Let's take a look at how this could be implemented. We will need to keep track of a boundary index so that we can remember where the sorted partition ends and the unsorted partition begins. To start with, this boundary index will just point to the first value in the array. We will then need another index to scan the values in the unsorted partition as we search for the least value. Of course, we'll also need an index to remember where the least value encountered is in the array. We then repeatedly find the position of the smallest value in the unsorted partition, swap that value with that at the boundary index, and advance the boundary index until the sorted partition spans the entire array, at which point we're done. Let's take a look at an example to see what that looks like. Here we have a small array containing random data. Initially, all the data is in the unsorted partition shown in white here. We then set the boundary index, called b in this slide, to point at the value at the beginning of the array. The value at that position in this example is 10, which we tentatively remember as the least value encountered so far, shown in green. We're now going to need another index, called p in this slide, which we use to scan the remaining values in the unsorted partition. As p progresses through the array, it updates the position of the least value encountered. For example, here it has encountered a 1, which is the least value encountered so far. Once p has scanned the entire unsorted partition, we're sure that we found the least value. So we swap the least value with the value at the boundary index, and we advance the boundary index one position to the right. In this case, we'll swap the values 1 and 10 and increment the boundary position. The sorted partition now contains the value 1 in this example, and we're ready to repeat the process. We take the value at the boundary to be the least value encountered so far, and we're ready to scan the rest of the data in the unsorted partition. Here we encounter a 2, so we update the position of the least value and we continue the scan. And when we're done, we swap the values at b and the index of the least value we encountered and increment b. And we're again ready to repeat the process. As we continue, we notice that the sorted partition gradually grows. Here's the next scan. Here's the swap, and so on. Let's watch as this process continues. At this point, if we increment the boundary, the sorted partition will comprise the entire array, and the unsorted partition will be empty, which means that the array is sorted and we're done. Great. At this point, you can pause the video and complete task 1, which is to implement selection sort in Python and test your implementation on randomly generated arrays. Hit play again when you're ready to continue. Very often, it is important that the algorithms we implement are efficient in terms of time taken and memory used, which are often referred to as time complexity and space or memory complexity respectively. The algorithms we're working on in this activity are quite efficient in terms of space complexity because we're not creating additional arrays during the sorting process, but what about time complexity? As already mentioned, later on in the course we'll look at ways to analyze complexity more formally. But for today, we'll actually time how long it takes Python to perform sorts on arrays of different sizes. Python has a core library called time, which exposes functions that return the current time. If we call these functions before and after a process in our code, we can look at the difference between the values returned to get the amount of time it took to carry out that process. Further details and an example of how we can use the time library to time how long it takes our computers to perform algorithms are provided in the task 2 description. Pause the video now and complete task 2, which is to record the average time it takes Python to carry out our implementation of selection sort across a range of array lengths. You might want to choose lengths of multiples of 5 up to a length of around 50 to get times taken over a wide range of lengths. Hit play again when you're ready to continue. Alright, the next sorting algorithm we'll consider is Quicksort. This is a divide and conquer algorithm, which means that it breaks a larger problem into smaller subproblems to solve and is usually implemented recursively. The basic idea behind Quicksort is to choose a pivot, which can be any value in the array, and then partition the array into 3 sections. A partition that only contains values no greater than the pivot, which we'll call the left partition, the pivot itself, and a partition that only contains values no less than the pivot, which we'll call the right partition. At that point, we keep the pivot in its correct position and recursively apply Quicksort to both the left and right partitions. We have some freedom as to how we can implement this, and there are many versions of Quicksort. For example, since we can choose any element in the array to be the pivot, one choice might be to always simply use the first element as the pivot. In general, however, we would like Quicksort to partition the array so that the left partition is roughly the same length as the right partition. If the data in the array is already sorted or roughly sorted, then choosing the first element in the array to be the pivot will tend to make the right partition, which contains values no less than the pivot, larger than the left partition, which can harm efficiency. Similarly, if we were to always use the last element as the pivot, the left partition would tend to be larger than the right partition. To avoid having Quicksort's efficiency being dependent on patterns of data stored in the array, one thing we can do is to choose the pivot at random, which is what we'll do in this activity. The way we'll implement Quicksort in this lab is as follows. Since we'll be applying Quicksort to different sections of the array at different times, let's refer to the section we're applying Quicksort to as a subarray. If the subarray is empty or only contains a single element, then it is already sorted, and we won't do anything. In terms of recursion, these cases are treated as breakout conditions. Otherwise, we'll start by randomly selecting an element in the subarray to be our pivot. We'll then swap this element to the first position in the subarray to move it out of the way, and then set up 2 indices to point at the second and last elements in the array. Let's call the index that points at the second element the left pointer, and the index that points at the last element the right pointer. We'll then scan the left pointer towards the right until we encounter a value that is greater than the pivot, or until moving to the right would take the left pointer outside the subarray. And similarly, scan the right pointer towards the left until we encounter a value that is less than the pivot, but still within the subarray. If the pointers cross over, it means that the right pointer is pointing to a value that is less than the pivot, and all values to the right of the right pointer are no less than that pivot. We then swap the value at the right pointer with that at the beginning of the array, which is where we place the pivot, at which point we have partitioned the array and can call Quicksort on the partition to the left of the right pointer, which is where the pivot now is, and again on the partition to the right of the right pointer. Otherwise, if the pointers have not crossed over, we swap the values at the left and right pointers to ensure they're in the correct partition and continue scanning. This may sound complicated, but it will be much clearer if we see it in action in an example. So here we have an array filled with random data. The first step is to pick a random element to be the pivot. In this case, the random element turned out to be the 8 shown in pink here. We then swap the pivot to the beginning of the array to get it out of the way. We then set up a left pointer called L here that points to the second element in the array, and a right pointer called R here that points to the last element in the array. We'll then scan L towards the right until we encounter a value that is greater than the pivot, and R towards the left until we encounter a value that is smaller than the pivot. In this case, the pointers immediately found values that met these conditions, so we swap the values found. L is now guaranteed to point to a value that is less than the pivot, and R points to a value that is greater than the pivot. Let's continue the scan. This time, the first value that L encountered that is greater than the pivot is 16, and the first value that R encountered that is less than the pivot is 7. L and R have not crossed over yet, so we simply swap these values. And we're ready to continue the scan. L and R now point to the values 10 and 3 respectively and haven't crossed each other yet, so let's swap these values. The next step is to continue the scan. And at this point, L and R have finally crossed over. R is guaranteed to point to a value no greater than the pivot, and all the values to the right of R must be no less than the pivot. The last step is to swap the selected pivot, which remember we moved to the beginning of the array, with the value at R. And finally, the array has been partitioned into the 3 desired sections. The elements in yellow are no greater than the pivot. This partition is followed by the pivot itself, shown in green, which is in the correct place. The pivot is followed by a partition containing elements no less than the pivot, shown in blue. Of course, the array has not been sorted yet, but the problem has been broken down into smaller subproblems. We'll recursively call Quicksort on the elements to the left of the pivot and again on the elements to the right of the pivot. We're now in depth 2 of the recursion, and this time Quicksort is only working on the subarray to the left of pivot 8 we found at depth 1. The first step is to randomly select a value in the subarray to be our pivot. In this case, the value 6, shown in pink, was selected. We move the pivot to the beginning of the subarray to get it out of the way. And we set up pointers L and R in the same way we did before. Again, L is going to scan towards the right until it finds a value greater than the pivot, and R is going to scan towards the left until it finds a value less than the pivot. In this case, the values found were 7 on the left and 3 on the right, which we swap. We then continue the scan. Here we find the values 8 on the left and 1 on the right, which we swap. We continue the scan. The pointers have crossed over, so we swap the value at the right pointer with the pivot. And we have successfully partitioned the subarray and are ready to call Quicksort on the left and right partitions. We are now at recursion depth 3, working on the subarray to the left of pivot 6 at recursion depth 2. Let's just continue until this subarray has been partitioned. Notice that in this case, the left partition is empty, which is a breakout condition. So when Quicksort is called on the left partition, it doesn't do anything. After that, Quicksort will be called on the right partition. And here we are at recursion depth 4, working on the subarray to the right of pivot 1 at recursion depth 3. Again, let's skip on until this subarray is partitioned. Now we call Quicksort on the left partition. And here we are at recursion depth 5. Again, we have a case where the left partition is empty, so Quicksort will not do anything when called on the left partition. But the right partition contains only one element, which is also a breakout condition for Quicksort. So Quicksort will not do anything when called on the right partition either, since that element is already in the correct position. We now jump back to recursion depth 3, where Quicksort was called on the partition to the right of pivot 6 at recursion depth 2. The algorithm similarly sorts the subarray. And now we've jumped back to recursion depth 2, where Quicksort was called on the subarray to the right of pivot 8 at recursion depth 1. Let's just skip through until the algorithm has completed. And we're done. At this stage, all the values in the array, shown finely in green, are in the correct sorted position. Notice that by selecting a random pivot, it is possible to get lopsided partitions. But on average, we expect the left and right partitions to be roughly of equal length, and subsequent subarrays that Quicksort is called on to be roughly half the length of parent subarrays. Alright, at this point you can pause the video and complete task 3, which is to implement Quicksort in Python and test your implementation on randomly generated arrays, and task 4, which is to time your implementation across different array lengths similarly to the way you did this for selection sort. Hit play again when you're ready to continue. Great. At this point, you have implemented and timed selection sort and Quicksort over a range of array lengths. The best way to illustrate how these times compare is to plot the times taken on the same set of axes, where the horizontal axis shows the length of the array and the vertical axis shows the average time taken for each algorithm to sort the data. If you do this, you should notice something interesting. Selection sort appears to outperform Quicksort in some cases and underperform in other cases. This suggests that we could write a hybrid sorting algorithm that delegates the sorting task to selection sort in some contexts and to Quicksort in others, so that the algorithm performs relatively well across the whole range of array lengths we've explored. Pause the video now and complete task 5, in which we explore the phenomenon of different sorting algorithms being optimal in different contexts, implement a hybrid sorting algorithm that delegates the sorting task to selection sort or Quicksort depending on the context, and compare the hybrid's performance to the pure selection sort and Quicksort implementations. Hit play again when you're ready to continue. At this point, we might be interested in taking a closer look at the built-in sort functionality of Python. This functionality is generally achieved using the sorted function and the sort method on lists. These are not the same thing, and the description for task 6 discusses some differences that we should be aware of as Python programmers. Of course, since Python is a mainstream language, a lot of effort has been made to ensure that algorithms used by Python for sorting are as efficient as possible over a broad range of contexts. Python actually makes use of a hybrid sorting algorithm called PowerSort, which you may be interested in reading up on. In any case, the final task before we write up a lab report for this activity is to see how well our algorithms perform against Python's built-in sorting algorithms. So at this point, you should be able to complete task 6, which is to compare the performance of Python's built-in sorting algorithms to your selection sort, Quicksort, and hybrid implementations, and task 7, which is to write up your lab report. And that's that. I hope you enjoyed the lab. Until next time.